December 1944, the Ardennes. A King Tiger commander, 29 years old, scans the snow ahead through the morning fog. His armor is the thickest in the world. The American gun pointed at him from 2,000 yards away cannot, according to every intelligence report he has been given for the past 6 months, hurt him. He is wrong. He has been wrong for almost 3 months, so have hundreds of other German tank commanders before him. They simply have not lived long enough to learn it. This is the story of a weapon the Germans never knew was on the battlefield until the men who could have warned them were already in the ground. To understand how it was possible, we have to go back, 4 months back, to another foggy morning in another part of Europe where the war was being fought in a way the Americans were already losing. The morning fog has not yet lifted from the hedgerows when the first shells begin to fall. It is August 7th, 1944. The place is a sunken lane east of the Norman village of Mortain. A Sherman tank from the 743rd Tank Battalion shudders to a halt behind a row of apple trees. 300 yards to the east, through the gaps in the hedge, the crew can see them, panthers, 5, maybe 6, moving in column along the road from St. Barthélemy. The gunner finds the lead tank in his sight. The range card strapped to his thigh says 900 yards. He waits one breath. He squeezes. The 75mm shell leaves the barrel at 2,000 feet per second. 3 seconds later it strikes the Panther's frontal plate at a shallow angle. It bounces, a pale orange spark, a flash of bright metal, and the Panther keeps moving. This is what American crews have been learning for 2 months, from Omaha Beach to Saint-Lô. From Carentan to the burning fields of the Falaise Pocket, they have been firing at German armor and watching their shells skip away like flat stones across cold water. The Sherman commander screams a single word into the intercom. Back. The driver throws the transmission into reverse. The tank lurches. Too slow. The Panther needs only one shot. Its long 75mm gun fires from 1,200 yards. The shell punches through 3.5 inches of American armor as if it were folded canvas. The Sherman burns. 5 men inside. 3 of them perhaps will live long enough to crawl out. That morning, across the Mortain front, the same scene repeats itself in different fields and different lanes. Dozens of times in a single day. The specific Sherman, the specific crew, are not known to history. The pattern is, by nightfall, the Americans will have held their ground. The German counteroffensive named Operation Lüttich will fail, not because American tanks have outfought German ones, but because American artillery and American air power and American numbers will simply grind the attack to a halt. But the tank-to-tank arithmetic of that day is what reaches the desks of officers far behind the line. The reports go back, from battalion to brigade, from brigade to division, from division to First Army headquarters, where tired ordnance officers read them one after another and find the same phrases repeating themselves. Ammunition ineffective at observed range. Vehicle lost to single round, frontal aspect. Crew morale deteriorating. The men reading these reports do not need a metallurgist to tell them what the problem is. The American 75mm gun, the workhorse weapon of every Sherman in Western Europe, cannot reliably defeat the frontal armor of a Panther beyond 500 yards. The 76mm, mounted on the newer Shermans and on the M10 and M18 tank destroyers, is only marginally better. Against a Tiger, both guns are useless from any angle except the side or the rear. There is, however, a gun that can solve this problem. It exists. It is being manufactured in Detroit at this very moment, and it has not been allowed near a Sherman tank. To understand why, we have to go back almost 3 years, to a quiet, carpeted room in the Pentagon, to a man who, more than any other single American officer, decided how the United States Army would fight tanks. His name is Leslie James McNair. In the summer of 1944 he is 61 years old, a small man, quiet, almost professorial in manner. He wears thick glasses that have failed his eyes since the Great War, when a piece of artillery shell took some of his hearing and most of his peripheral vision. He commands Army ground forces. Every infantry division, every tank destroyer battalion, every training program in the United States Army passes across his desk. He is by reputation brilliant, by temperament stubborn, by doctrine certain. McNair believes that tanks are not for fighting other tanks. Tanks, he believes, are for exploiting breakthroughs, for racing into the enemy rear, for shooting up infantry columns and supply trucks. When enemy tanks appear in front of friendly armor, they are to be handled by a separate force, a force built for one purpose only, to find and to kill panzers. He calls these vehicles tank destroyers. They are fast, they are open-topped, they are lightly armored, they are built to ambush, to fire 2 rounds, and to vanish before the enemy can return fire. They are not built to slug it out with a Panther at 400 yards. On paper, the doctrine is elegant. By the summer of 1944, it is falling apart. The tank destroyers in Normandy are dying in their hedgerows. The Germans, who do not read American doctrinal manuals, refuse to fight the way McNair predicted they would. They do not attack in massed armor formations that can be ambushed. They defend in depth with infantry and dug-in anti-tank guns. They counterattack with Panthers that outrange and outgun every mobile weapon McNair has provided. In the early summer of 1944, several officers inside the Ordnance Department put forward a proposal. Take a Sherman. Strip out the 75, replace it with a 90. McNair refuses. The 76mm, he insists, is sufficient. He has the test data to prove it. The tests, conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1943, had shown the 76 penetrating Panther armor at adequate combat ranges. What the tests had not shown, what nobody discovered until the Panthers actually appeared in France, was that the German tank's armor had a face-hardened surface that caused American shells to shatter on impact. The Aberdeen data had been collected against plates that did not behave the way Panther plates behaved in real combat. The data was wrong, the doctrine was wrong. But on a hot July afternoon in 1944, McNair did not yet know this. He flew to Normandy on July 25th. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, the great American breakout. The offensive named Cobra, the doctrine he had built, executed at full scale, breaking the German defense and racing into the open country beyond. Cobra opened with a bombing raid by the 8th Air Force, more than 1,500 heavy bombers, each carrying tons of high explosive. The target was a narrow strip of German front line near the village of La Chapelle-en-Juge. The bombers came in waves. Some of them dropped their loads short. A B-17 released its bombs 900 meters too early. Several other aircraft followed. The bombs fell among American positions of the 30th Infantry Division and the 9th Infantry Division, and into the observation area where Lieutenant General McNair had taken cover in a slit trench. A bomb landed beside his trench. The crater, when American engineers reached it, was more than 3 meters deep. They identified him by the 3 silver stars on his collar and by his West Point class ring. There was little else left to identify. He was the highest-ranking American officer to die in combat in the Second World War. He was killed by his own Air Force. His death, brutal as it was, removed an obstacle, not from the M36 itself. That program belonged to the Tank Destroyer Command under Major General Andrew Davis Bruce, and it had been moving forward on its own track. The first M36 had rolled off the assembly line in April. Production was already underway. What McNair's death removed was the broader institutional resistance to upgunning American armor in general. The Sherman 90mm proposal that he had blocked was now revisited. The M36 deliveries to Europe, slowed by training schedules and logistical hesitations rooted in McNair's doctrine, began to accelerate. The man who had insisted that the existing guns were good enough was in the ground at Normandy American Cemetery. The guns that were not good enough were finally going to be replaced. The gun itself was not new. In the late 1930s, the United States Army had begun looking for a replacement for its aging 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. The 3-inch had served well in the First World War, but aircraft had changed. They flew higher, they flew faster. The Army needed a gun that could throw a heavier shell to a greater altitude with more velocity. The result was the 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun. By 1940, it was in production. By 1942, it was guarding ports and airfields from Hawaii to Long Island. It fired a 24-pound shell at 2,800 feet per second. It could reach a target at 34,000 feet of altitude. It was designed, from its very first blueprint, to look up at the sky, to shoot down German bombers and Japanese fighters, and anything else that moved through the high cold air. But somewhere in the Ordnance Department, in the early summer of 1942, an engineer whose name has not survived in the records noticed something. The same velocity that drove a 90mm shell to 34,000 feet would also, if the gun were aimed horizontally, drive that shell through almost any tank then in existence on the surface of the Earth. The 90mm was, by accident of physics, the most powerful anti-tank weapon in the American inventory. It had simply been pointed at the wrong target. The conversion was given a project designation, T-71. The objective was to take the 90mm gun, modify it for anti-armor work, and mount it on a chassis that could move and fight on the same terrain as a tank. The chassis chosen was the M10-0A1. The M10 was already in service. It was in essence a Sherman hull with a different turret and a 3-inch gun. The new project would take the same hull, discard the existing turret entirely, and design a larger one to hold the 90. The new turret was called the T7. It was open-topped. The decision was deliberate. A closed turret would have added more than 2 tons of weight, and the chassis, already at the edge of its limit, could not absorb it. The crew would be exposed to artillery airbursts and to enemy infantry firing down from upper-story windows. That was the price. The benefit was a weapon that, on paper, could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger at 2,000 yards. The first pilot vehicle was tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in March of 1944. The results matched the engineers' predictions. Against 30-degree homogeneous test plates, the 90mm punched through every armor plate placed in front of it, 5 inches, 6 inches, 7 inches. Each plate in turn was breached. Against the actual front of a King Tiger, at the actual ranges of the actual war, the truth would prove more complicated. But that lesson was still in the future. A man watching the test, an ordnance captain whose name has not been preserved, was overheard to say a single sentence: "This will end the Tigers." He was wrong about that, in the literal sense. The Tigers would continue to roll across Europe until the last days of the war, but he was right about something larger. Something the Germans had not yet imagined. In April of 1944, the Fisher Body Division of General Motors at the Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan began series production. The new vehicle was given the designation M36. The men who would crew it almost never spoke its formal nickname. To them it was simply the 36, or the 90. The first vehicles rolled off the assembly line in late spring. By July, more than 100 had been built. By August, more than 300. Almost none of them were in Europe. They sat in motor pools, in rail yards, on the decks of cargo ships crossing the grey Atlantic. McNair was dead, but the bureaucracy that had built itself around his doctrine was not. The M36 was a new vehicle. It required training, it required ammunition stockpiles, it required logistical planning. The army moved with the patience of an institution that had not yet been embarrassed enough to hurry. Meanwhile, in Normandy, in Mortain, and now in the forests of the German frontier, American crews continued to die in burning Shermans and disabled M10s. The arithmetic was something like this. The Germans were losing tanks too, at a much higher overall rate than the Americans, because American industry could absorb almost any number of losses. But on the tactical level, on the level of individual crews fighting individual engagements, the Germans were still winning more often than they lost. A single Panther in a good hedgerow could destroy 4 or 5 Shermans before it was finally killed by an artillery shell or a flanking shot from a tank destroyer that had crept around its blindside. That was the math of 1944, the math that the Ordnance Department, finally with McNair in the ground at Normandy American Cemetery, was permitted to change. The first M36s reached the European theatre in the last week of September. They came off the cargo ships at Cherbourg and at Antwerp and were sent forward by rail and by truck convoy. They were distributed in small numbers to existing tank destroyer battalions, most of which had been operating M10 Wolverines since the Beaches, the 776th in Italy, the 702nd, the 654th, the 703rd, the 814th, the 644th, numbered units, names that meant little to anyone outside the men who served inside them. Names that, in October of 1944, were about to test a weapon that no one outside a small circle of ordnance officers fully understood. The crews who received their new vehicles noticed something immediately. The M36 looked almost identical to the old M10. The hull was the same, the tracks were the same. The driver's compartment was the same, only the turret was different, larger, squarer, and the gun barrel projecting from it was slightly longer and slightly thicker than the 76mm they had been firing for the past 4 months. The memoranda that accompanied those deliveries, issued from 1st Army Ordnance in the early weeks of October 1944, all carried a variation of the same instruction. Engage enemy heavy armor at maximum effective range. Do not let the Germans understand what they are facing. In simpler words, the Germans do not yet know what is coming. Keep it that way. The men who would crew the new vehicles arrived at their depots in the first weeks of October. Some had been pulled out of the line for a few days. Others were entire crews of brand new replacements, just off the boats from the United States, who had never sat inside a Sherman or an M10 or any tracked vehicle at all. They were shown the M36. To a man who had been driving an M10 since the Normandy beaches, the difference was almost invisible. Same hull, same suspension. Same open turret with the same canvas weather cover that never quite kept the rain out. The instructor pointed at the gun, 90mm. The crews looked at it, then they looked at the instructor. A few of them laughed. They had been told their guns could not kill what was hunting them. For 4 months they had absorbed that lesson the hard way, in burning hedgerows from Caen to Aachen. The idea that the army had finally produced a weapon that could change the math seemed, on first hearing, like another rumour in a war full of rumours. The training period was brief. There was no time for anything else. A few rounds fired at salvaged German hulks pulled to the edge of a field, a few practiced traverses, a briefing on the new ammunition, and then back to the line. The first M36 engagements in Western Europe occurred in the 3rd and 4th weeks of October 1944. The exact details of the first kill are not known. The records of the battalions involved are incomplete, and the participants, in many cases, did not live long enough after the war to be interviewed in detail. But somewhere in the rolling farmland east of the German border, an American tank destroyer platoon found itself, on a cold afternoon, watching a column of Panthers and assault guns advancing through the open ground in support of a local counterattack. The platoon was concealed along a ridge, hull down behind a low stone wall built by some Belgian farmer 2 centuries earlier and still standing. The range, when the gunner found the lead Panther in his telescope, was a little more than 2,000 yards. In any other American vehicle in the inventory, that range was useless. A 76mm round fired at 2,000 yards against a Panther's frontal plate would not have made the crew inside flinch. The platoon leader hesitated. He had been taught, by every instinct of 4 months in combat, to wait until the German tanks closed to under 1,000 yards. He had been taught that anything longer was a waste of ammunition. He had been taught that you only revealed your position when you had a good chance of killing your target. He looked at the new gun. He gave the order. The first round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. The recoil rocked the chassis backward against its suspension. The empty shell case, brass and hot, slammed into the catcher behind the breech with a sound like a steel hammer dropped onto a steel floor. The shell crossed the 2,000 yards in just over 3 seconds. It struck the lead Panther in the turret front. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the Panther's turret hatch blew off its hinges. A bright tongue of flame, perhaps 30 feet long, shot up from inside the tank. The vehicle stopped moving. Black smoke began to climb in a column straight up into the grey October sky. The American platoon leader took the radio handset from his loader. He keyed the microphone. He did not, for a long moment, know what to say. He had just killed a Panther at 2,000 yards. Nobody in his battalion, in his regiment, in his division, had ever done that before. The previous arithmetic of the war did not allow it. The new arithmetic was being written, that afternoon, in the smoke rising over a Belgian field. The Germans inside the surviving Panthers heard the impact. They saw the lead tank die. They could not see who had killed it. They reported the loss up the chain of command. In the afternoon, when the engagement was over and the surviving German armour had withdrawn, the company commander wrote his after-action report. He had to record the loss of the Panther. He had to explain the cause of the loss. The phrase he chose was straightforward: heavy artillery fire from concealed positions. He had not seen a tank destroyer. There had been no muzzle flash visible across the open ground. There had been only the crack of an arriving shell at a range that no American tank destroyer was supposed to be capable of reaching. His commander up the line accepted the explanation without question. This was the first crack in the German intelligence picture. It was also the first example of a pattern that would repeat itself day after day for the next 10 weeks. Across the autumn of 1944, German tanks would be destroyed at impossible ranges by an enemy weapon that did not, as far as German intelligence was concerned, exist. Each loss would be filed. Each report would attribute the destruction to something familiar: towed anti-tank guns, heavy artillery on a flat trajectory, improved ammunition for an existing American gun. The one explanation that fit all the evidence, that the Americans had quietly fielded a new tank destroyer with a 90mm weapon, was never seriously considered. To understand why, you have to understand how German intelligence worked. By the autumn of 1944, the German army was fighting on three fronts. In the east, against a Soviet army that had ground its way from Stalingrad to the Vistula; in the south, against Allied forces grinding up the Italian peninsula; in the west, against the British and the Americans now lapping at the German border itself. Intelligence resources were stretched to the breaking point. The organization responsible for assessing Western Allied capabilities was called Fremde Heer West, Foreign Armies West. It was a department within the German General Staff, staffed by professional intelligence officers with years of experience. It maintained a vast catalogue of Allied equipment. Photographs, specifications, capabilities. Every vehicle the British or Americans were known to operate had a file in Berlin, sometimes hundreds of pages long. The M36 was in that file. The file said it carried a 76mm gun. The file was wrong. How does a professional intelligence organization, with serious analysts and well-trained photo interpreters, get such a fundamental detail wrong? The answer is not laziness. The answer is something deeper and more universal. A reconnaissance photograph taken from a Luftwaffe aircraft at high altitude shows a vehicle in a motor pool from a distance of several thousand feet. The analyst on the ground, working from a magnified print, can see the hull shape. He can see the turret outline. He can sometimes see faintly the gun barrel. He cannot, from that distance, distinguish a 90mm barrel from a 76mm barrel. The difference between the two is about a centimetre, so he compares what he sees to his catalogue. He finds a match, M10 Wolverine, or occasionally the new M36 variant, which he has been told carries the same gun as the M10. The match is logged. The report is filed. The file confirms what the file already says. This is what intelligence officers decades later would call confirmation bias. It is the tendency of any analytical system, human or institutional, to find what it expects to find. The German file said the M36 carried a 76mm gun, so every M36 the Germans saw, in every photograph and from every distance, carried a 76mm gun, even when it didn't. There were, of course, opportunities for the Germans to correct this picture. In the late autumn of 1944, several M36 Jacksons were knocked out in combat and left on ground that the Germans temporarily controlled. Some were destroyed by mines, others by ambushing infantry with handheld anti-tank weapons. A few were abandoned by their crews after mechanical breakdowns when no recovery vehicle could reach them. The Germans examined these wrecks. Engineer teams from the Waffenamt, the German Army's weapons procurement office, went forward to measure, to photograph, to document. They unscrewed gun barrels and slid calipers across the bores. They opened ammunition lockers and lifted out 24-pound shells stenciled clearly in white paint with the figure 90. They knew in the field what they were looking at. The information they gathered should have reached Berlin within days. It did not. By November of 1944, Berlin was a city under almost continuous bombardment. The Royal Air Force came at night. The United States Army Air Forces came in the day. Government ministries had relocated to scattered bunkers and dispersed offices across the surrounding countryside. The Waffenamt was in the process of evacuating part of its operations to facilities in Thuringia. Far from the bomb plots, reports moved slowly. Paperwork piled up in transit. A technical assessment of a captured American vehicle, no matter how important, had to compete for attention with 1,000 other documents being shuffled between burning buildings. And so the measurements taken in the field, the calipers across the bore, the photographs of the shells, the engineer's neat handwritten notes specifying 90mm, sat in crates. They moved by truck, they moved by rail, they sat in waiting rooms in towns whose names no longer mattered. The cycle from frontline field report to confirmed bulletin distributed back to combat units in any properly functioning army takes a few days at most. In the Wehrmacht of late 1944, that cycle was running 4 to 6 weeks. By the time the captured M36 reports finally reached Berlin and were finally distributed back to frontline commanders, the Battle of the Bulge was already underway. The information was, in the most literal sense, too late. In the first half of December 1944, an unnatural quiet settled over the Ardennes forest. The American units holding the line there were tired. Some, like the 28th Infantry Division, had been ground down in the Hürtgen forest and sent to a quiet sector to recover. Others, like the 106th Infantry Division, had only just arrived from the United States. They had never been in combat. They had never seen a German soldier. They were learning the line, getting accustomed to the cold, settling into the bunkers and farmhouses that would, in 3 days' time, become for many of them their tombs. The tank destroyer battalions along the front were similarly distributed, some experienced, some new. The 814th was attached to the 7th Armoured Division in reserve. The 705th was attached to the 4th Infantry Division and would soon be sent to Bastogne. The 644th and the 703rd and the 776 were scattered across the broader front. A few of them had M36s now. Most of them did not yet realize how many. On the German side of the line, hidden by fog and by strict radio silence, the largest armored force Germany would ever assemble in the West was moving into its starting position. 3 armies, 25 divisions, more than 400,000 men, nearly 700 tanks and assault guns, among them, in 2 specific units that would carry the heavy end of the breakthrough effort, were tanks that even by the standards of 1944 were monstrous. Tiger IIs, Heavy SS Tank Battalion 501, Heavy Tank Battalion 516, 68 tons each, frontal armor 150 mm thick, sloped at 50 degrees. 88mm guns, the long version, capable of killing any Allied vehicle ever built at any range from which an Allied vehicle could fire back. The men who commanded them believed, with reason, that they were driving the most formidable tanks on Earth. They also believed, on the basis of every intelligence briefing they had received in the previous 6 months, that American mobile anti-tank weapons capped out at 76mm. On the night of the 15th of December, those tank crews ate their last hot meal for what would prove to be many weeks. They wrote what they thought might be last letters home. They climbed into their vehicles and waited for the order. At 5:30 in the morning of the 16th, the order came. 2,000 German guns opened fire along an 85-mile front. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. When it lifted, the tanks began to roll. The town of St. Vith sits at a crossroads in the eastern Belgian Ardennes. 5 roads meet there. In the kind of war the Germans were trying to fight, a war of speed, of breakthrough, of armoured columns slicing west toward the Meuse River, those 5 roads were everything. Without St. Vith, the entire German timetable came apart. With it, the German 6th Panzer Army could pour west in a torrent the thin American defences could not hope to contain. By the morning of the 17th of December, German armour was driving hard for the town. The Americans defending it were a patchwork. The 7th Armoured Division, ordered down from a quiet rest area to the north, had begun arriving in the small hours of the 17th. Survivors of the 106th Infantry Division, what was left of it, were filtering back from the catastrophe further east. Engineers, military police, broken artillery crews, anyone with a rifle was being put into the line. Attached to the 7th Armoured was the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Some of its vehicles were M10s, some were the new M36s. The crews of the M36s, men who in many cases had received their new gun only 6 or 8 weeks earlier, found themselves on the morning of the 18th looking through their telescopes at a kind of target they had never previously been in a position to engage. Tiger IIs, the German monsters, the apex of the war, advancing in column through the fog. The fog itself was both shield and weapon. It hid the American positions. It also hid the German advance until the German tanks were already within range. There was no air support. There would be no air support for days. The weather had grounded the 8th Air Force, and it would keep them grounded until the 23rd. The American crews had to do this alone. They did it the only way they knew how. They sat hull down behind hedgerows and stone walls and the burned-out shells of barns. They let the German tanks come on. They waited until the lead Tiger was perhaps 1,500 yards away, sometimes less. Then they fired. A 90mm round at 1,500 yards against a Tiger II's frontal armor did not always penetrate, but it almost always made the Tiger commander flinch. It almost always forced the German column to stop, to deploy, to look for the source of fire. And while the German column was stopping and deploying and looking, the American crew was already backing out of its firing position, repositioning 200 yards down the line, ready to fire again from a new direction. This is what tank destroyer doctrine had always promised: fire, displace, disappear. For 4 months in Normandy and the Hürtgen, the doctrine had been frustrated by the inadequacy of the gun. Now at last the gun matched the doctrine, and the men using it had the tactical sense, the calm hands, the patient triggers to make the doctrine work. St. Vith held for 6 days. It should have held for 2. The delay it imposed on the German timetable broke the offensive. Not by itself. Other things broke it too, the fuel that the Germans ran out of, the American reinforcements that arrived from every direction, the weather that finally cleared on the 23rd and brought the American Air Force down on the German columns like a hammer dropped from the sky. But St. Vith was where it began to come apart, and among the weapons that bought those 6 days were the long-barreled M36s of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, firing from hedge lines that the Germans could not see, with a gun that the Germans did not yet know existed. While St. Vith was holding in the south, another fight was unfolding in the north. A column of SS armor, the spearhead of the entire offensive, was driving for the Meuse River. Its commander was SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, 29 years old, a handsome, hard-eyed man who had commanded armor on the Eastern Front and who, by the standards of his own organization, was a rising star. His column was called Kampfgruppe Pieper. It contained Panthers, half-tracks, infantry and armoured personnel carriers, and a company of Tiger IIs from Heavy SS Tank Battalion 501. The Tiger IIs were under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Heinz von Westenhagen, 33 years old, suffering from chronic and often disabling headaches from a head wound he had taken in Russia the year before. He had been advised to take medical leave. He had refused. Pieper's mission was simple in concept and impossible in execution: race west, cross the Meuse, drive toward Antwerp. The roads through which he had to race were narrow Belgian country lanes, threading through villages with names like Stoumont, L'Église, Stavelot. The Tiger IIs he commanded, 68 tons each, were too heavy for many of the bridges along those roads. Their fuel consumption was enormous. The German planners had counted on capturing American fuel depots along the way. They did not capture them. By the 23rd of December, Piper's column was strung out across miles of Belgian countryside. American infantry from the 30th Infantry Division was closing in from the north. American armor was closing in from the south. American tank destroyers, some of them M36s, were firing into the column from positions that the Germans, fixed by terrain and by fuel exhaustion, could no longer maneuver to suppress. The fuel was almost gone. In the village of L'Église, Pieper concentrated what was left of his combat power, including most of his surviving Tiger IIs. On the 24th of December, with the weather finally clearing, American P-47 Thunderbolts came down on the village in waves. Rockets, 500-pound bombs. Strafing runs that left long lines of brass shell casings glittering in the snow. The Tiger IIs parked in the streets made magnificent targets. That night, after dark, Pieper ordered the remnant of his column, a few hundred men on foot, to abandon the vehicles and break out east through the woods. They left 39 armoured vehicles in L'Église, including the surviving Tiger IIs from Heavy SS Tank Battalion 501. Most were intact. They were simply out of fuel. Heinz von Westenhagen escaped on foot with the rest. He would survive another 3 months. On the 19th of March 1945, in circumstances that historians still dispute, he died near the Austrian-Hungarian border. Most surviving sources record it as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 33 years old. Further south, at almost the same moment, another German armoured thrust was being broken. The town of Mannheim sits at a road junction in the central Ardennes. On the night of the 24th of December, elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich attacked through it, attempting to push west toward Liège. The American defense fell apart under the pressure. Mannheim itself was lost, but just beyond it in the village of Grandmesnil, a small American force held. Among them were M36s of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Through the late hours of the 24th and the cold grey morning of the 25th, those vehicles engaged the lead elements of the SS armour at ranges between 500 and 1500 yards. They fired, they displaced, they fired again. They lost some of their number. The M36's open turret and thin armour made it vulnerable at close range, and several were destroyed by German fire and by Panzerschreck rocket teams. But they killed Panthers and Panzer IVs in numbers the German commanders found difficult to comprehend. A German after-action report from the engagement, written within hours of its end, contained a single sentence that would prove important. American tank destroyer fire of unusually high penetration, possibly employing British tungsten core ammunition. That sentence was the seed of what would become, for several more critical weeks, the dominant German explanation for what was happening to their armour. The British, since the spring of 1944, had been fielding tungsten core armour-piercing rounds for their 17-pounder anti-tank guns. The rounds were a closely held technical secret. Their performance against German armour was extraordinary. A 17-pounder firing tungsten could defeat a Panther's frontal armour at 1500 yards and a Tiger's at almost any combat range. German intelligence had been aware of the British tungsten rounds since the summer. When German tank crews began dying at impossible ranges in October, November, and December of 1944, the analysts looking for an explanation reached for the one they already had. The Americans, they concluded, must be using British ammunition. Either the British were providing tungsten rounds to American tank destroyer battalions, or the Americans had reverse-engineered the British design and were producing their own. Either way, the conclusion was the same. The gun was the old 76mm. The ammunition was the new variable. It was an elegant theory. It explained everything the field reports were showing. It also happened to be entirely wrong. But because it was elegant, and because it required no fundamental revision of the German equipment catalogue, and because it was easier to believe than the alternative, that the Americans had quietly fielded an entirely new tank destroyer with a much larger gun, and that German intelligence had completely missed it, it became the working assumption of the German army's response to the crisis. German panzer crews, in the closing days of the Ardennes offensive, were told to maintain greater standoff ranges, to distrust American tank destroyers at all distances, to assume the 76mm could now reach them where it could not reach them before. They were given excellent advice for the wrong reason. The gun killing them was not a 76 firing a magic round. It was a 90. It had been a 90 all along. And until the Germans understood that, they would keep planning their tactics around a weapon that did not exist, while the actual weapon, still calmly working from hedge lines and ridge tops across the Western Front, kept reaching across the battlefield and killing them. The bulge would end. The German offensive would die in its own fuel exhaustion and in the storm of American air power that finally fell on it in the last days of December. The war would move on, but the secret of the M36 would hold, in its essential form, for another 2 weeks, 2 weeks in which the war's final shape was already being decided. The bulge was dying. By the first days of January 1945, the great German offensive in the West had collapsed back upon itself. Fuel exhaustion had finished what American firepower had begun. Across the snow-covered Ardennes, the wreckage of an army that would never again take the field at full strength lay scattered in burned-out fields and frozen ditches. Tigers and Panthers, fueled with nothing but their crew's last bitterness, sat where their engines had died. Many had been blown up by their own men with the last grenades in the last pouches. Others had simply been abandoned, hatches open to the falling snow. The American advance was steady now, methodical, almost weary. Men who had been fighting since June were grinding eastward through villages, whose names they could not pronounce and would never forget. It was somewhere in the first 2 weeks of January, in a bunker on the eastern side of the lines, that a German intelligence officer finally read a report he should have read in October. The report had taken its time getting there. It had been written by an engineer team that had measured a knocked-out American tank destroyer. It had moved by truck, then by rail, then by another truck. It had sat in a waiting room in Berlin. It had been forwarded, lost, and forwarded again. By the time it reached the front, its data was 4 months old, but the data, when it was read, was unambiguous. The American M36 tank destroyer carried a 90mm gun. Not a 76. Not a 76 firing British tungsten ammunition. A 90. A new bulletin went out from German 6th Panzer Army to its subordinate units in the first weeks of January 1945. It was distributed across the surviving panzer formations. The wording, in dry military German, conveyed a single piece of information. Effective immediately, all American tank destroyers were to be presumed to carry 90mm guns. Engagement ranges were to be adjusted. Frontal exposure to American mobile anti-tank fire was to be avoided beyond 2,000 meters. Coordination with artillery was to be improved. The bulletin reached the front in the second and third weeks of January. By that point, the German Panzer Arm had already lost most of its remaining offensive striking power in the west. The Tigers and Panthers it had taken 3 years to build, and train and fuel were either burning in the Ardennes or fleeing east toward the Rhine. The information about the American gun, when it finally arrived, was tactically valuable to perhaps a few hundred surviving tank crews. It was, in every other sense, 3 months late. There is a kind of silence that settles over a man when he reads news he should have had a long time ago. The German intelligence officer who first read the bulletin, his name is not preserved in the surviving records, would have understood what the document represented. It was the after-action report of a 4-month failure. It was the confession of a system that had photographed the new American vehicle and looked at it and seen the old one. It was the price tag, in burnt tanks and dead men, of an institutional habit. He would have folded the report. He would have placed it in a file. He would have gone on to the next piece of paper. There was no time in January of 1945 for German officers to dwell on what they should have known. The Americans were already moving toward the Rhine. The campaign that followed had a businesslike quality, Operation Veritable in the north, where British and Canadian forces drove southeast through the Reichswald. Operation Grenade further south, where the US Ninth Army crossed the Roer River and drove east toward the Rhine, the First Army in the center. The Third Army to the south, racing along the Moselle. The German defense was hollowing out. Whole divisions existed now only on paper. The men who manned the line were old, or very young, or both. Volkssturm units of 50-year-old reservists and 16-year-old apprentices held positions that only a year earlier had been held by veterans of the Eastern Front. They fought hard in places. They surrendered in droves in others. The thread of the German army was unraveling now in real time. The M36 was everywhere along the Allied front, in growing numbers. By March of 1945, more than 1,700 had been built, and the production rate was climbing toward 200 a month. Crews who had begun the war on M10s, who had transitioned through M18s, who had received their first M36 in some half-frozen depot in October, were now the experienced men of the tank destroyer arm. They had killed Panthers and Tigers and Tiger IIs. They had buried friends. They were, by any honest definition, professionals at a kind of work no one would have asked them to learn if there had been any other way. On the morning of the 7th of March 1945, a forward detachment of the 9th Armoured Division reached the western bank of the Rhine, just south of the town of Remagen. They expected to find the Ludendorff Bridge destroyed. It was not, for reasons that historians have argued over ever since. German engineers laying the demolition charges that failed to detonate fully, German command confusion in the chain of orders, simple bad luck for the defenders and good luck for the attackers. The bridge was still standing. American infantry rushed it under fire and got across before the next German demolition attempt could be made. Engineers cut the wires that were still wired. A toehold was established on the eastern bank, on German soil, across the last great geographic barrier in the west. The 656th Tank Destroyer Battalion, with its M36s, was among the first armoured units to cross. The bridge groaned under their weight. The wooden planks the engineers had laid across the railway ties shifted under each set of tracks. The crews held their breath as they rolled across, knowing the bridge could collapse beneath them, knowing also that what mattered now was to get the long guns onto the eastern bank before the Germans rallied a counterattack. The bridge did, in fact, collapse 10 days later, killing 28 American engineers, but by then it did not matter. By then there were pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, ferry crossings. The Rhine had been jumped. The war in Europe, in any meaningful military sense, was over. It would take another 2 months for that fact to be admitted on the German side, but the math was now beyond argument. And the M36, after 5.5 months at the front, was no longer secret in any sense. It was by March of 1945 simply a weapon. This is where the story should end. The hidden gun reveals itself, the enemy adjusts, the war moves on. But there are two things that need to be said before the story ends, because they change the meaning of everything that came before. The first is about the gun. In the years after the war, when American ordnance officers compiled the technical data from Aberdeen Proving Ground and matched it against the after-action reports from Europe, a clearer picture emerged of what the 90mm could and could not do. The standard armor-piercing round, the M37, fired from the 90mm M3 gun, was an excellent weapon by the standards of 1944. Against 30-degree sloped armor, it could penetrate roughly 120mm at 500 yards, at 1,000 yards about 108mm, at 2,000 yards about 91. At 3,000 yards, the figure dropped to the low 70s. These are the numbers from the technical manuals. Now hold those numbers next to the frontal armor of a Tiger II. The hull glacis of a Tiger II was 150mm thick, sloped at 50 degrees. Effective armor thickness against a horizontally fired shell was approximately 233mm. The turret front was 180mm thick, vertical or close to it. A 90mm M77 round fired at 2,000 yards could not penetrate any frontal aspect of a Tiger II. It could not do it at 3,000 yards either. At 3,000 yards it could barely scratch the side of the turret. The new tungsten-cored HVAP round, the T30E16, was significantly more powerful. It could penetrate Tiger II frontal armor, but only at ranges under about 500 yards, and even then only at favorable angles and only if the gunner placed the shot precisely. In other words, the popular image of the M36 calmly reaching across 3,000 yards of open ground and punching neat holes through Tiger IIs is, in plain terms, a myth. The real kill zone of the M36 against heavy German armor was much smaller. It was the band between 800 and 1,500 yards, and it usually required a shot at the side or rear of the German tank, where the armor was thinner and the angles were favorable. The M36 was effective. It was effective enough to change the war, but its effectiveness lay not in any one-shot miracle at impossible range. It lay in something less cinematic and more lethal. It lay in the M36's ability to threaten German armor at ranges where before German armor had been completely safe. It lay in the M36's ability to force German commanders to maneuver, to expose flanks, to slow down, to hesitate, to second-guess every advance. It lay in patience, in firing at the right moment from the right angle, in displacing before the German artillery could find the gun, in doing the hard, unglamorous work of being in the right hedge at the right hour. The legend of the 3,000-yard kill is a story we have told ourselves about the war. The actual war, the war as it was fought, was won at closer ranges, against tougher angles, by men who almost never wrote memoirs, and who did not, when interviewed years later, claim impossible shots they had not actually made. The second thing that needs to be said is harder. In 1946, the Army's Armoured School at Fort Knox began compiling lessons learned from the war. They interviewed surviving crews from the tank destroyer battalions. They reviewed thousands of after-action reports. They cross-referenced kill claims against captured German records. They tried, with the time and resources they had, to understand what had worked and what had not. One of their findings, recorded in a series of reports including the European Theatre of Operations General Board Report No. 60, was unexpected. Many tank destroyer crewmen who had used both the M18 Hellcat and the M36 Jackson preferred the M18. The M18 was faster, 55 miles per hour on a good road, twice the speed of the M36. The M18 was smaller, harder to see, harder to hit. The M18 carried only a 76mm gun, less powerful than the M36's 90, but adequate against the great majority of German targets at the ranges where most tank destroyer engagements actually took place. The M36 had the bigger gun, but the M18 had the legs, and in the kind of war the men were actually fighting, a war of ambush and displacement and brief flashes of intense violence, the legs mattered more than the gun. This is not what the post-war mythology says. The post-war mythology, the version of the war that has been retold 1,000 times in books and films, and at the bars where old men used to drink, says that bigger guns won the war. that the M36 was a triumph, that the men who crewed it were grateful for it, that every increment of penetration brought the soldiers closer to home. The actual men who used the actual machines often said something more complicated. They said that surviving mattered more than killing. They said that they would have traded a heavier gun for a faster vehicle in many situations without thinking twice. They said that the M36 was a good weapon, but the M18 was the weapon they trusted. The history we tell about wars is rarely the history the men who fought them would have written. The legends grow up around what makes the best story. The real soldiers, the men who came back, knew that war is mostly waiting and fear and small, exhausted decisions about whether to run or stand or fire. They knew that the bigger gun is not always the better tool. They did not, by and large, contradict the legend. They mostly just got quiet when it was told. By the time the war in Europe ended, in May of 1945, the M36 had destroyed an estimated 350 German armored vehicles. The figure is approximate. Battlefield reporting was imperfect, kill claims were sometimes inflated, and not every destroyed German tank could be cross-referenced to a specific American weapon. But the estimate, drawn from post-war studies by historians including Stephen Zaloga and Harry Yaid working from both American and German records, is the best one available. Among those 350 kills were perhaps 40 Tiger IIs, out of fewer than 500 Tiger IIs ever built. In raw numbers, this was a small contribution to the overall destruction of the German armored force, the great majority of which was lost on the Eastern Front to Soviet armor and Soviet anti-tank guns and Soviet weather. The Western Front killed fewer Tigers and Tiger IIs than the Eastern Front in absolute terms, but the M36's contribution was disproportionate to its numbers. It killed at long range what nothing else in the American inventory could kill at long range. It forced the German Panzer arm to fight defensively in the West when it would have preferred to fight aggressively. It denied the Tiger II the psychological dominance it had been designed to project. And it did all of this for almost 3 months without the German army knowing it existed. After the war, the M36 stayed in service longer than almost anyone in 1945 would have predicted. The United States Army used it in Korea, briefly, in the early 1950s. By then it was considered obsolete. The Soviet T-34-85, which it had been built to defeat, was easy enough to kill. But newer Soviet tanks were on the horizon, and the open-top tank destroyer concept had been abandoned in favor of true main battle tanks. The M36 was passed to America's allies. France used them in Algeria, Yugoslavia kept them in service into the 1960s, South Korea retained them for decades. The last operational M36s, and this is a small, almost forgotten fact, served in the Army of the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan into the early 1990s. A weapon built in Detroit in 1944 to kill king tigers in Belgian villages, still rolling out on training grounds in the Taiwan Strait 45 years after the war that produced it had ended. The last of them were retired around 1993. Somewhere on Taiwan, in a quiet motor pool, a young soldier born in the 1970s climbed down from the open turret of an M36, wiped grease from his hands, and walked away from the vehicle for the last time. He probably did not know who Joachim Pieper had been. He probably did not know what a King Tiger was. He probably had no idea that the gun in front of his commander's seat had originally been designed to shoot down B-17s. To him it was just an old machine. A relic, a piece of history nobody talked about anymore. That was the last day of the M36's working life. What does any of this mean? It is tempting, when the story is told this way, to make the M36 a hero, to make its gun a wonder weapon. To say that the Americans won the war because they had better technology than the Germans. The men who actually fought the war would have laughed at that. Some of them did laugh at it, in interviews recorded decades later by historians at Fort Benning and Fort Knox and at oral history centers across the country. They knew what had won the war. What had won the war was a country that could build 2,300 M36s, while Germany was building 490 Tiger IIs. What had won the war was an intelligence system that, however imperfect, was 3 months ahead of the German intelligence system that it was beating. What had won the war was thousands of men in numbered battalions, sitting in cold hedgerows in countries they had never expected to see, doing a job they had been trained for in a way that mostly worked. The M36 was not a wonder weapon. There were no wonder weapons. The Germans had wonder weapons, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, Tiger II tanks, and the wonder weapons did not save them. What saved the Allies was the opposite of wonder. It was patience and arithmetic and the willingness of factories in Detroit and Michigan and Indiana to keep producing month after month after month, and the willingness of young men from Iowa and Texas and Pennsylvania to keep climbing into open-topped turrets and aiming guns at enemies they had been told they could not beat. They beat them, not with a single magic shot at 3,000 yards, not with a single weapon kept secret long enough to matter, but with all of it together. The industry, the intelligence, the patience, the willingness to wait in a hedge in Belgium in December and to do the work when the moment came that the work required. The gun that looked up at the sky pointed back at the earth, the men who fired it mostly going home, and the rest, as they say, is history.